Hi everyone, welcome back to First Principles. Today we've got a repeat guest, Greg. How you doing, Greg?
Doing great. How are you, Saagar?
I'm very well. I know it's been a while since I've recorded an episode, so thank you for coming on and
Of course.
restarting this. I don't know when the next episode's going to be, but this is how it is. What have you been up to?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a couple projects. I care deeply about the abundance in the world, and I happen to think there's a couple of things coming. I think that everybody's been talking about energy abundance, and how that's going to be the foundation for the future. But I think beyond that, there's many entrepreneurs working on that. They're going to do amazing things. But one step beyond that, I honestly think the big bottleneck for abundance is going to be water. Something like 60% of GDP in the world requires fresh water,
Yeah,
which is kind of intuitive. Humans require it.
right.
Food requires it. It's an important piece of the world. And if we're going to bring everybody up to American levels of standard of living and beyond,
Mm.
we're going to be needing a ton of fresh water. And so I've been focused on that lately. And so, I've been working with a partner. We've got a path to hopefully desalinating oceans worth of water to terraform the American Southwest. So, it's a long journey to that end. And I think we have our first step we're working on right now, which is using stranded natural gas to purify water that comes out of oil wells.
All right. I am
Kind of a,
submitting my resume to you for that.
yeah, it's a fun project, but, it's something I had never thought about. But
Mm.
when you dig a barrel of oil out of the ground, you also dig out in Texas 4 barrels of water.
Right.
And that water is toxic and people are paying to get rid of it. And so we can offer a product that's actually cheaper than the product that people use now to get rid of that water that happens to also put it back into the hydrological cycle. So we could start to turn, 20, 40 million barrels of water, back into the environment. So that's just the beginning. But after that, many, many water products to come.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty good. I mean, I don't know how cagey
Yeah.
you want to be about this, but be as cagey as you want to, but I wish you all the best.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, the details are still being formed, but it's called Stranded Gas Pro,
Yeah.
strandedgas.pro. It's a marketplace for stranded gas, where we're going to start to be a buyer on our own marketplace in order to solve this problem. But
All right.
yeah,
So you're creating
early
the
days.
marketplace and you'll be the buyer. And of course, you'll
Going to
have
be
a
a
tech
buyer on
stack
it.
to take
Yeah,
care of it. Mm.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that'll help us develop the machines we'll need in order to do, you know, millions of acre feet a year, which, is the kind of scale you need to actually feed a town like Houston.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to need a lot of water. It's incredible to think about how much water humans need. But I did some back of the napkin math with like, a basic system that doesn't require much technological innovation. And it creates competitive water, like price competitive water in the Texas market, at the levels where you would need no water from the ground or rivers. Just pulling it out of the ocean, desalinating it, and
And
yeah,
wastewater.
we're on the cusp of that. Yeah, fresh water for everybody. Never have to touch any natural ecosystem ever again.
Yeah, and all those articles I used to read like 10 years ago that the next wars are going to be on water. I mean,
Right.
like, I don't understand why is the zero sum thinking so embedded? Like, what do you have a
Well,
take on it?
absolutely. I think that most people think most things are scarce.
Right.
Um, and that's the reality of people that grew up in poverty. I think especially like it is the reality that things are scarce.
Mm.
Um, and so you develop a worldview around that. And I think privileged folks, especially folks in developed countries, can sometimes look beyond that and kind of assume the opposite. And that's also naive that nothing is
Yeah.
scarce.
Yeah.
But I happen to think the pragmatic middle is that things are far less scarce than we think if we build the tools and technology and the businesses to do it. I
Right.
mean, we talk about lithium, for God's sakes. People were panicking that there would never be enough lithium on Earth to do the renewable transition.
Yeah.
There's that old meme that, it has the United States in the middle, and it's like, oh my gosh, we need this critical resource for national security and the future of humanity. Oh my gosh, China is the only one that has it, and 90% of the supply. Oh my gosh, somebody stumbles across, some random farmer in the middle of nowhere stumbles
Yeah.
across enough to power, the world for 100 years,
It keeps
and the
happening.
cycle repeats, right?
Yeah.
And it's like that's just minerals,
Yeah.
But minerals is then stacked up to machines, and I think people can kind of intuit that a bit more when they think about it. But water is one of those things where you look at a river, you look at you look at a reservoir and you see the level going down, and you're like, I can't manufacture water. I can't go dig water, out of the ground. Those wells are getting deeper and deeper and they're drying up. And it's just like the imagination's not there. But,
Right. You got
I
the
think that
oceans.
when you connect the dots, when you connect the dots that the world's, surface is mostly water, we just need the energy to access, the non-saline, like desalinating the water out. Then it becomes clear, if energy gets cheap, then water should get cheap.
Yeah.
But that's just the missing thing for most folks, is that it's not scarce. It's just we haven't taken the time to access it. And there are countries that are better able to access it than others because they have the wealth to invest extra capital to do so. Whereas some poorer countries have to decide between, am I going to build a road or am I going to build a dam, right? Am I going to build desalination or am I going to build electricity for people that have never had electricity?
Right.
It's a hard choice for them.
So this malaise, I don't think it's only with like folks who have been like poor. And by the way, like that's the history. Everybody was poor, a while ago. And then, some people get rich. Now, when I use the word wealth, even people, I mean, they just assume conflict. I said, well, they assume conflict, which, yes, sure. I mean, if you take it from others, but then that doesn't have to be the case. So this zero-sum malaise is also, it kind of affects privileged folks as well, because they don't know where they got it from. They have no idea how to create it. And then they assume that, we don't want to take so much, we just want, like, we want to be like above you guys, but we don't want to be like taking so much more. So in that guise, they're going to stop growth. They're going to stop all the innovation and or what other things in the guise. I mean, I don't know if it's that cynical. Sometimes it might be, but it's mostly like, with good intentions. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's like, it's a mindset issue. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a failure of imagination that is powered by a misunderstanding of where things come from.
And where do they come from?
So I talked to a lot of folks, and I always had this question, which is, if you doubled the amount of money in everybody's bank account, would everybody be better off?
I don't know.
Right?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so is the answer. I'm pretty sure the answer is no. And I'm pretty sure the answer is no because everybody would double prices the next day because they knew that everybody had twice as much money.
Yeah.
Right? Like, fundamentally, wealth is not money, right?
Right.
People think it is because you need money to be wealthy now.
Yeah.
But imagine money disappeared today. Wealth would be the capacity to consume everything that you want and more, right?
Yes.
Whether that's food or vacations or a house, right? And so if you think about, like, if I wanted to make everybody on earth wealthy, take money out of the equation, we'd need to like 10-tuple the amount of houses. We'd need to double the amount of food. We'd need to be able to handle more travel, which means more cars, which means more roads, which means more electricity, which means more mining, right? So like, this is about the idea of like, supply is where wealth comes from.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
There's infinite demand for consumption. It's just that money is how we decide what gets actually created. But if you take money out of the equation, it's like, we just need to make more stuff and services to make people wealthy. And I think, I grew up in America. What's that?
That people want.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And that money is how we decide, I want this more than you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so therefore I'm going to get this versus that. No, it's totally fine. But I grew up in America, and I think a lot of folks that I grew up with, like, they think that money is where wealth comes from.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is they have not seen a world go from, like abject poverty to like no longer on subsistence farming. And I think that when a society does that within living memory, people start to intuit like, oh, wealth comes from making things.
Right.
And that's where I think like you get this philosophy. It's like, we just need to make more stuff. But the question is, how do you make more stuff? The analogy I like to think of is like, think about a farmer and a masseuse, right? Like, a farmer has an infinitely high productivity ceiling because they can hire, they can make more machines, they can buy more, you can do more automation to make more water, to make more machines, to make more food, to make more fertilizer, to make, and the cycle can go on forever. But a masseuse, for another example, is like, they only have 24 hours in a day and they should probably sleep for at least 8 of them, right? So like, there's a ceiling to their productivity, but like, there isn't infinite demand for massages, but there is like, like, food is one of those things where we must have it. So I think what we're dealing with is like, we need to be focusing on how can we unleash productivity on the things that everybody needs. That's food, water, shelter, healthcare. and the foundations of those are minerals, water, electricity, transportation, and things like that. And so it's the question of like, how do we make more stuff? And I think there's this decision that people make in their heads, which is kind of like reasoning by analogy. It's like, here's the world that we have today. The way we're going to make more stuff or make it so people can afford more stuff is we take money from over here and we give it over here.
Right.
Right. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. It's like, sure, I agree that inequality sucks. But inequality wouldn't matter if everybody was living like a billionaire. Like, it's not the inequality that's the problem. It's the lack of supply that those folks have access to.
Yeah.
And how do we do that? It's like we need to unleash productivity to make more stuff so that it's cheap enough that everybody can afford it.
Yeah, I mean, we could.
I think that's where we need to go.
We could address inequality in the sense that, if somebody, like there is a book called Equal is Unfair, which I'm like, I get it. I get that part. Like if people are not dying and stuff, we could, if everybody was living in a Jane Austen novel, then that's a decent sort of thing to debate about. But, inequality in itself, I don't know. I don't think that's the biggest thing. The biggest problem is the creation of wealth. So I agree with you.
Exactly. And I think that what happens is that the accumulation of wealth perpetuates abuse of power.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that the folks that want to redistribute wealth, they're not like wrong that they're seeing powerful people kind of abuse the system. That's 100% the case. Regulatory capture is real. Pharmaceutical companies essentially can block out any competition. It's really hard to get into industries that really matter. The FDA makes it hard to make food that competes with big agra. We need to make it so that we're all in a level playing field, and then these things will start to work themselves out. We can disrupt these bad players and so on. And I think that's the easier path than trying to, get a council together and decide how much people deserve. I like broccoli. Other people don't like broccoli. How in the world is there going to be somebody that's like, yes, you get this unit of broccoli per year and they get that unit of broccoli per year? It's mind-bogglingly complicated.
It's a disturbing question. I mean, I decide what I value, I don't know how you decide what I value. So yeah, true. I mean, okay.
So we have, and I think what I think of this is like, look, we all want to live in heaven.
Yeah.
We all have different definitions of what that is. And I think that socialism is an attempted shortcut to heaven. I think that, we do live in a world where if we organized ourselves in 50 years, there would be no scarcity.
Right.
Right. And like, I think that is true. And I think if you are a socialist, you're like, great, then that means we should seize the means of production and we should redistribute wealth. And,
you need to produce it first.
That's a shortcut.
You need to produce it to redistribute. I mean,
that's where it falls apart for sure. Right. We've seen that in practice, but my point is that like, it's a shortcut to heaven that's based on a good idea or like a good desire and an understanding of the world. It's like, there really isn't scarcity. We just need to access it. And the question is like, do we want to care about the practicality of getting there? Or do we want to care about like the moral standing of we want to do better? And so the question is, we are all here sitting, asking ourselves, what is the best system to get us to, a lack of scarcity for folks? And I happen to think that the proof has been in the pudding that the only one that works is capitalism, where you weed out the cronies, right? Where you get rid of rent seeking, right? Because, socialism has created this shortcut and it has its failings. I think that the world that we live in, where it's market-based, but it's not, purely competitive, you have similar failings of accumulation of power. So the enemy is accumulation of power. And if we can combat that, then we can develop the productivity that is required to create, unimaginable abundance.
Material nature as it is, which basically is poverty, is also a deeper enemy, right? I mean, if accumulation of power is one way to address it, for you, you have wealth, but then for others, you don't. So can we dive into these concepts? Like, can you define per your understanding what like pure capitalism is? And then more interestingly, what cronyism is and what rent seeking is?
Sure. Yes. So I think that, to describe the world, I think we live in a crony capitalist, mostly world. I don't think there's much else in the world. It's just varying levels of that.
Yeah.
So capitalism, is not just markets. We had markets thousands of years ago. You'd literally go to a market and you'd go over here and this product would be this price and that product would be that price, and there'd be competition, right? That has existed forever. Now, the difference between that and capitalism is how do we encourage the reinvestment of capital, right? So if I make profits, where do those go? And it was the idea that, okay, if I have money, one of the things that I could do is then invest in making more of that thing, right? I can increase the productivity of my workers by giving them, tools. I could figure out what is the optimal schedule for crop rotation. These things require research, they require development. And that's where, capitalism really came from, is like the reinvestment of capital. How is it allocated? And that is the accumulation of things that are separate from goods, right? There's capital and goods. And so then the accumulation of capital, the things that make things, land, tools, factories, so on, that's what creates, a flywheel of wealth. And that worked out because the Industrial Revolution is the proof of the pudding that works. Everybody went from subsistence farmers where like 90% plus of labor of humanity was focused on agriculture to now it's less than like 2 or 3% in the United States. And that means that we have time to do everything else. We are better fed, everything. Now, what happens in every society is that people are selfish and they want more. And some people are psychopaths and are willing to get more at the expense of others. And so what they do is they say, well, I could either compete in this ruthless marketplace that creates capital and improves the lot of everybody, or I could, tip the scales in my favor. Right. And, money is the distillation of power. And so then it gets turned back into power to create, little bubbles where, I'm going to keep people out where they can't compete with me. And that creates crony capitalism. And what it looks like in practice, and you can see this in the Western world a lot, is companies creating laws that make it impossible for new entrants to compete. Right? It's like I have a better product and it takes me 10 times more work to get in and compete and disrupt those folks, which means that nobody gets the benefit of the innovation. Right? I have the innovation, I have the better product. It might 10 or 20 times the cheapness, I should say. It drops the price a lot, but it's not allowed to enter the market because of barriers, and that's crony capitalism. It's people that are wealthy using the system to maintain their position at the expense of everybody else.
Like the feudal
that
lords.
exists in every political system. What's that?
Like old feudal lords.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a version of feudalism. I think that we got through feudalism to more democratic and capitalistic system, and we are always at risk of sliding backwards into feudalism. I think feudalism is the steady state for human nature as it is today. If people were perfectly angelic motivations, I think we could all live a very different life. But given that humans are the way they are, if you think feudalism is the natural state, and we are, we've done a good job of pushing ourselves beyond that, but it takes constant maintenance to keep those folks out of power. And I think, we need combating rent-seeking, combating monopolies, combating, like regulatory capture that keeps people out is how we prevent going back to feudalism.
Regulatory capture and a fusion of power is how you kind of defined cronyism. But let's say you had a government which doesn't really care about, not care about, but the separation of economy and the state. If somebody becomes a monopolist just by being, I don't know, how do I put this, doing very well in the market, just basically winning hearts and minds and dollars. Is that the same kind of monopoly as a cronyist monopoly, or is that accepted to celebrate?
That's where the rubber meets the road on actually governing capitalism. Right. All disruption is at its foundation a temporary monopoly that is a good thing.
Okay.
Right. So if somebody, if the steady state is call it gas cars, and gas cars have hit a peak where it's like they're just the same all the time. They're just like slightly different every year, right? And then somebody comes in with electric vehicles that are better, faster, cheaper in every way. Again, we're not quite there, but that analogy of like, we've been in a steady state. Smartphones, right? Smartphones are just the same black box. They've been that way for a long time.
Yeah.
And if somebody comes in with something that's way better, a temporary monopoly is a good thing because you disrupt the incumbents. You force the change to a new equilibrium that is better, right? The question is, in that moment that they have the temporary monopoly, do they solidify power to keep that monopoly forever or for a really long period of time? And that's the question. Amazon had a pretty damn big monopoly on cloud computing for a long time, but it was really good because they weren't abusing it.
Yeah.
Right. It was so much cheaper than the existing paradigm that it was like, sure, they're making tons of money, but that's still good.
Yeah.
And then I think what happened was that, we got to this point where they started to ratchet up the prices, the margins were still really high. And there was almost an oligopoly where everybody agreed to keep their profits really high. And so we were actually, there was a better equilibrium, but nobody was doing it. Right. And that's not good. Right. That's more cronyist. We should allow competition that's going to bring those things down. I think that temporary monopolies are good. The question that I don't have a good answer to is, when do you break up a monopoly that is no longer good? And I think that, the U.S. system has essentially been, when they start abusing customers is when you break it up.
Right.
And that's the question is, are they abusing their customers? I think that's an okay thing. But then you get Amazon where they were not abusing their customers, but they were accumulating so much of the market share that it pushed out all the small players. It's just like, eventually the Amazon e-commerce system is going to be just Amazon basics. And then it's like, okay, our entire economy for basic goods is Amazon. So do we have the forethought to stop it, or should we have the forethought to stop that? Or do we have to wait until they transgress before we break it up? That's a hard question.
Do you believe political power, which essentially being the power of the gun, is always separate, or just like being really successful in the marketplace could automatically translate to political power? Even if, let's say, you were living in a very laissez-faire, let's say, system, which we don't live in, but like, let's say we were, could you have like a monopoly in which anybody else doesn't come in? Like, in the sense that if a new cloud computing framework gets created with, I don't know, let's say thermodynamic chips, and you don't need cloud computing anymore because you can be distributed again, and then you can store way more data. It doesn't take that much. Some new computing paradigm comes in. I think that's when, by the way, monopolies genuinely break, even if they are there with political power. But what I'm asking is, just because I've done very well, does that automatically translate to political power, or does it need to be like an actual regulatory capture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the proof is in old money versus new money. Okay. Who has more power?
Right.
You can kind of see this play out. Think about the life of Bill Gates.
Right.
When he was young and very, very wealthy, wealthiest man in the world, he had power, but he didn't have nearly as much power as a senator. Right. Microsoft still got broken up. Right. He was the wealthiest man in the world by a large margin. And, the next few, on the list, the top 10 were also Microsoft folks. So right. It's just, it obviously doesn't directly translate, because if they could have stopped it, they would have stopped.
Right.
But at the same time, Bill Gates now has way more power than he did before. And you can see that because what he wants to happen happens.
Happens, yeah.
Right, because my definition of power is, the ability to make things happen.
Yeah.
And money does translate into some power because you can buy what you want. But the question is, kind of like the blood-brain barrier in your health. Like, can money buy politics? Right. If you create a perfect barrier, then money does not equal power, and that's a good thing, right? Because then the economy is separate. You have competition in that realm, and then you have the political competition, which happens in the democratic fashion. That would be ideal. But building that barrier is incredibly difficult, and it's temporary. Right. You can't just build a law that says that there's a barrier and then it perfectly works. Right. Like, people are wily. They're going to figure ways through and around it.
Yeah.
Or they do Citizens United, completely puncture the barrier entirely.
Right.
And so that's the question, is like, how do you do that? Because in say, on one extreme, you have anarcho-capitalism. There is no barrier between, money and power, because literally the definition of anarcho-capitalism is there is no state. So the only power there is money. And so, like, I think that's bad, because you do need a barrier, because the power of a gun should always be held collectively.
Right.
I think that when the power of a gun is held by the wealthy, it's feudalism. When the power of the gun is held by, the people collectively, then you have a democracy. And I think that's far, far better. It's more accountable. That's my personal belief. But
I'll just add one thing, though.
Yeah.
Collectively, yes, but then that could translate to, like, the French Revolution, the Jacobins, or whatever, right? So it needs to also be based on a principle which, I
Sure.
think protects individual liberty, which US gets
Yes.
very close to it, but like,
Yes.
yeah, all right.
Yeah. Mob mentality is definitely a thing, and that's why you don't have a democracy. You have
Mm,
a republic in the
hmm.
United States, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I think democracies are chaotic.
Mm,
I think democracies work on small scales, which is why
yes.
you have republics, right?
Mm,
If you have the democracy of your city and the democracy of your state,
mm,
I think that that's a better system than the democracy of an entire country. I think like
mm,
you see it in India, it's very difficult to maintain, a purely huge democracy with a billion people in it.
yeah.
I do think you need like a republic where it's like you're delegating down powers. And I think that the more local, the better.
Mm,
Because then, the most power is at the smallest level, which is the most pure democracy with the people that are most aligned with each other.
right.
Right. And that's just, I think my opinion of how I interpret history and how I interpret what I've seen work and not work, in my own country.
Right, right, right. It's also like if you have the like most power with the individuals, and then power sort of like becomes less concentrated. It's a good
I
way to
think a
sort
lot.
of
Yeah,
remove coercion from society, in a way.
exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because I think coercion. I was talking to my wife about this. I think that everybody's version of the government that they think is ideal
Hmm.
requires human nature to change someone,
Ah, yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Right. So like socialism. I keep diving into it because I'm like, there's got to be like a practical plan that socialists have for
Yeah.
how are you going to get people to agree to share.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really everything seems to come down to once the capitalists are gone, humans are going to be better people.
Hmm.
And the only barrier between us being sharing and good is this, these selfish people at the top that create this coercion. And it's like, I don't know if that's true. I think human nature is flawed. I think we're all greedy. And so when you
And
take
also
that
contradictory.
layer off, exactly, we are not one thing. And so I think that what happens is people get into power, they strip off the capitalists, people aren't acting the way they want. And so like, well, I'm going to fill the gap between the human nature I need and the human nature I have with coercion.
Right.
Right. And I think that's everybody's idea for everything. It's like, if you don't have an accurate assessment of human nature, you're going to have coercion, whether it's fascism. It's like everybody should love the state. Everybody should love, our country and our culture and our race and blah, blah, blah. Right. Fascism requires human nature to be something it's not,
Hmm.
something honestly worse than it is.
Hmm.
And so it requires coercion to implement that way. And I think that capitalism is kind of like harnessing human nature. It's harnessing greed. It's harnessing our desire for more, and harnessing it to create an equilibrium that like lifts people up
It's also
by
harnessing
producing more
benevolence.
good.
Like even the good angels
Yes.
of nature, it is harnessing because if you,
Yes.
when you serve people, you get rich, So it's like a win-win, which I know it's
Yes.
overly, I am painting a caricature version of it, but that's kind of the ideal. I mean, it's
Right.
it's not a bad thing. So
Right. And cronyism is essentially the lie
yeah,
that humans should serve you.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
As the cronyist, right?
Right.
As the wealthy person, people should serve you, and therefore you use coercion of various means to make that happen.
Yeah.
And so I think that having a accurate understanding of humanity is a prerequisite to designing a system that actually works.
Hmm.
And I have, I think pragmatic, but maybe more pessimistic view of how humans are today.
Hmm.
And I hope for better. And I think that culture is one of those ways that kind of slowly, change people over time. But I do think that, we need to work with the way humans are. Otherwise, we're going to be requiring violence to create the system that we have.
And it's not going
And
to
I
be
think
one
violence
time.
is the ultimate. Yeah.
It's a
Violence
race
is
to the
the
bottom.
ultimate evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You had an interesting theory about reduction of violence being a civilizing
Mm-hmm.
force, right? So could you maybe elucidate that and also mix that in with, if we focus too much on reducing violence, then the kind of vitality which is required for new ideas, growth, and freedom also gets zapped.
Yes.
So how do you balance it?
Well, I think that's the thing is that I think that zero violence is ideal.
Right.
What I think is competition should never be zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, my theory here is that, the better a society is organized, the more people compete in the levels of business and in elections instead of on a battlefield, right? So if you think about, the way, a capitalist society should work, a democratic capitalist world should work. The idea is that, I'm not going to go kill my neighbor to steal his house or, her food. I'm going to compete in the realm of business to provide for myself, right?
Yeah.
And so between business people, maybe I work for a company, and so I'm, competing with my labor to provide for myself, as opposed to, picking up a spear and stealing it. And if I'm a business person, I'm competing with other business people instead of hiring a private army to murder them.
Yeah.
Right. That's how it's supposed to work. And it's like, duh, right? Like, of course, that would be a better system, but that's how it worked for a really long time. It's like,
still does in many places.
If I had if I owned all this farmland and my neighbor didn't own farmland, but he had 10 guys with spears that were willing to kill people, he owned my farmland.
Yeah.
I could either work for him or die, right?
Yeah.
And that's how it works. And we've essentially built systems that make that not happen.
Yeah. By using force, mind you, it's not just by convincing. I mean, the state
it's not
uses
amount of force.
Yes.
It's the use of a little bit of force to reduce the overall amount of force, much larger amount. So, and I think that we've been on this train for humanity. It's not been linear, constant, but we've gone from, nomads that are family units or maybe smaller than that to like tribes, to warlords, to monarchies, to, feudalist societies, and then I think the next step up was democracy and capitalism.
Yeah.
But each step was better than the last one. It wasn't perfect. I think Catholicism was a very civilizing force for Europe in its time.
Yeah.
But then again, when politics and power and religion get together, it creates coercion, and it hit a ceiling. And so then you needed something that was better than that. And so humanity, as you can see, has been a series of experiments on what systems work. We remember the ones that worked because they spread.
Yeah.
And then we all hit the ceiling, and then somebody created a different one, and that was better. And we remember that one because then it spread, right? And so I think that each level reduced violence. And it's more about it reduced violence within its sphere. So think about like going from nomads to tribes. It's like the tribe was bigger than the nomad group. And so the violence within that group was much lower.
Yeah.
And it was like very, like we're sharing everything in that group. But between tribes, all bets are off. We're going to kill each other. But then you had, like early religions that bound, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people together. And that was like a more civilizing force, but it hit its limit. Where like, and those limits are technology. Those limits are like the actual system. You can't have a religion that is spanning the globe if you don't have instantaneous communication or communication that's really fast. So there are these limits, and so we create different systems. And within that group, you can cooperate. Outside of that group, you can't cooperate. And so then we kept growing, right? And so monarchies, like, and you can see this on the maps of humanity, like the maps of countries got bigger countries. But the maps of empires and monarchies and so on were bigger over time because they were able to control larger groups of folks and help them cooperate. And then we hit a system, I think democracy and capitalism are like a perfect pairing that almost can handle any amount of humans. The question is, can you span 8 billion people with one government? I'm not sure if the answer is yes, but I do know that you can definitely do it with 300 and some odd million in America. I've seen it work fairly well in India. I'm not sure if you could have one government over all of it, but I do think that we are at a point where it's unimaginable levels of cooperation that we have before. We really have low amounts of crime and we have low amounts of war compared to the way things were thousands of years ago. And that's because we agree to not do that, because we built systems where it's actually, like I'm not being irrational by choosing to not be violent. It's that the price of violence is higher than the reward of violence.
Yeah.
So if you can make the reward on violence lower, then the amount of violence will go down. And that requires the rule of law, enforcing contracts, making sure that people don't steal from each other, and all that stuff that allows us to cooperate, not hate our neighbor or be suspicious of our neighbor. It just takes a lot of work to maintain that.
If all of this was in service of some kind of a steady state economy, I think that would not be very inspiring. But the benefit of this is like one with like a grounding of individual You could say that, like different people have different things. Some people say governments grant people rights. I don't tend to believe in that. I think you have rights. But then maybe that's a legal fiction. Maybe like the Ayn Rand view is that you need those rights in order to be free to use your mind to work, in order to whatever produce wealth, and that is how you live.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you have rights. And the religious definition is that God gives you rights and governments just protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the traditional definition outside America is government grants you rights, which is like a more
Yeah.
like a some kind of a royal decree or a feudal grant, which that I don't like that,
Mm-hmm.
but these two I can work with. Anyway, so with that grounding, if you have the capitalism, you don't have the steady state system. You have stability, sure, but you're trying to get to like basically more, because that's also part of human nature. More, not at the expense of others, but I mean, if you believe in the panpsychist view where every hydrogen atom has some kind of a consciousness, then yes, maybe at the expense of those hydrogen atoms, but not at the expense of other sentient creatures. So I think that is something which I would like. Which is nice. So I want to connect that to your definition of abundance and the bubble of abundance, the
Yeah.
phrase you used, and then
Mm-hmm.
maybe we can talk about the expanding bubble and all that. So could you tie this together?
Absolutely. So, abundance, I don't think is an inevitable end goal
Mm.
of capitalism. I believe that it's something we have to strive for and we have to protect and we have to prepare for.
Okay.
But it is possible through capitalism. And I think that it's a worthy goal, and that's why I advocate for it. I try to talk to folks about it. It's like if we expect it, then we can plan for it. If we plan for it, then we might actually get it. And I think that fundamentally the problem that I'm encountering is people can't even imagine that is possible, let alone working for it. And so I want people to understand, like, technology is not magic. And abundance is also not magic. Abundance is the world in which we make so much stuff that you have everything that you could possibly want, right? And I don't think that there's a switch that flips where you go from the way it is today, where some people have everything they want, some people have most of what they want, and most other folks have not what they want. And then the other day, like everybody has everything they want. It's going to be a steady progress.
You can't have a Manhattan Project for that.
Well, I mean, you could, but it's not. Right. Manhattan Project still took years, right?
Right.
It's not a flip of a switch. It is going to be a process.
Right.
And the way I think about it is that there are bubbles of abundance in the world, and right now that abundance is with a small group of people. It's not geographic, it's with a small group of people, and it's because they've accumulated enough wealth, either by good means or by ill means, they have abundance. And so the question is, how do we expand that bubble of abundance? I happen to think that the best way to think about it is not. This is my problem with more socialist ideas is they want to take the bubble from rich people and make it bigger, right? They want to like make the bubble. They think of it as the wealthy have as abundance, so we need to spread it, right? I happen to think it's better to think about we need a bubble geographically, because the prerequisites for abundance is we need unimaginable amounts of electricity, water, minerals, wood, labor, and intelligence, right? Like all of the foundations for things you actually need, because we need food, we need shelter, we need clothes, we need transportation for all of this to work. We need, like churches and synagogues and, put mosques for folks to go and have community and worship. There needs to be community centers and schools and all of these things. They all require at the base amount, they need stuff that is tied to land. Right? Water doesn't come out of nowhere, right? Water comes from somewhere, on the Earth's surface or under it or above it. But it's like you have to be tied to land. So where in the world could we put a dome and say within this we have everything we need for abundance? We have all the minerals we need, all of the water we could possibly want, all of the the labor that we need, everything we could need. And how big does that dome have to be? Because it's obviously not like 1 square centimeter, right? It's I don't know if it's the whole Earth. I think it could be much smaller than that. And I think that the way to get from where we are to a level of abundance is we need to pick a place or pick a few places where this is possible and do it. And it's not going to happen by itself. Like we need, there's no place on Earth where that dome exists, where there's also the political will and the accumulation of entrepreneurs that we need to make it actually happen. And so we I think that the best place to put this bubble that's most likely to work is over Texas.
Okay.
Because, Texas has enough land where you're probably going to find every bit of mineral you'd ever need if you look for it. You've got a coastline, so you have unlimited water. You've got plenty of oil. You've got plenty of sunshine, lots of energy, plenty of wind. Plenty of, plenty of people. I think that if we organized ourselves, folks could there would be enough people to produce everything that those people would need. I don't think you'd need to go outside of Texas necessarily. I'm not saying that we enforce some sort of bubble. I'm saying that you could do it, which means you probably have the raw materials to make this level of abundance. But what it requires, the prerequisite is we need to be producing so much stuff people don't even understand. We need to create so much energy that you can't use it all. We need to create so much water that we have to shut off the valves of producing it because we just can't consume it all, right? And what is that going to require? It's going to require so many solar panels, so many oil wells, so many gas turbines, so many mines or, other ways of getting material, so much transportation, so much robotics.
Let me just throw in some SMRs and, all those things as well, but sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anything that produces energy, right? It's going to take everything we have to make this happen. It's going to make the Manhattan Project look like nothing. But I think that what's nice about it is you don't get a bunch of people cloistered off in a corner and then they come back in a few years and they have it. I think what happens is, we start this project, we create this culture of we're going to do this and this is going to be the best place on earth to live. And we're going to make the future of humanity something that we're going to be all proud of. And I think it starts in a place and then it expands. So imagine that we, pick Texas. That's why I'm moving there. I think this is the one place on earth right now that you could actually do this.
Okay.
Because you have, we're as close as possible in Texas to the governance structure that you need to make this happen.
Right.
And so what you need is to produce a ton. And you need to produce so much that the margins for selling it are so thin that you really can't plan it. It really has to be organic. It has to be, because imagine, I'm talking about grocery bills where it's every year you're spending $40 on groceries. That's what I mean by abundance. You spend $5 on a car, right? You get an in-home robot for $10. You get your yearly electricity bill is 5 cents, right? That's what I'm talking about.
And
about,
you can buy a house for $100.
We have to produce. Exactly.
Right.
Right. That's how much we need to produce in order for the prices to come down to the point where that's the level of abundance I'm talking about.
Let's say that again.
And that requires margins.
Drive this in. Say that again. Groceries. Just go for it again.
Yeah. Your annual grocery bill is $5. Your house is $100, or your rent for a year is $50. I know it sounds fanciful, but if we produced enough stuff, that would be the natural price of things.
Yeah.
That requires us to do an immense amount of reorganization of what we produce and how.
Right.
But it's only possible today. It wasn't possible 20 years ago. It wasn't possible 500 years ago. Because we finally have I call it the holy trinity of technologies.
Which is?
That can make this happen, right? It's artificial intelligence, it's robotics, and it's solar power. We are getting to the point where, the main costs of solar panels are now, it's actually the electricity to go in and the minerals. And the minerals are getting cheaper because we're finding them and refining them. But you can imagine these are a self-reinforcing triad, right? The more intelligence I have, the more I can, automate administration or any sort of thing that requires people. I can design systems faster or design them completely automatically. I can make efficient markets. That's intelligence. Robotics. If I had 1 billion humanoid robots in Texas, it's great. Shipping, mining, right? Everything gets cheaper. And it gets unlimited amounts of it. And then solar power to power it all, right? Because AI requires a ton of electricity and so will robots. And the processes to make intelligence and make robots require a lot of electricity for mining, refining, manufacturing, and just running these machines. So this is the Holy Trinity. And literally, I can't imagine anything that with this Holy Trinity can't be brought down in price.
And this is self-improving.
Right? Even healthcare.
So the goods are going to go down,
Exactly.
but the capital goods also would become more efficient.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So imagine, today we had 100,000 robots and 100,000 humanoid level intelligences, right? I wouldn't have human intelligences doing customer service. I'd probably have them be doing physics projects, engineering projects, things that could be used to make more stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have 100,000 robots. It's like, great. Then you have you have the robots acting out the mining and refining and the things that are currently really cheap, but not cheap enough, right? Food is remarkably cheap compared to what it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The amount of labor that a human had to do to survive was almost 100%. Usually it's over 100%. That's why they died.
Yeah.
And so, food is a lot cheaper today, but it's still not cheap enough. Not for me, right? Like we want $5 grocery bills, which means we need to create more food. But the main components is the cost of food: water, fertilizer, labor, and land. Right? And so labor, great. We need to get more robots to do it because it's a hard job for humans to do. So we need more robots doing those jobs. We need more robots, in the process of making fertilizer, so that fertilizer is cheaper. We need cheaper transportation, right? In order to make tractors cheaper and make getting things to and from the farm cheaper, right? It's like those Russian nesting dolls, right? The price inside of the price is transportation, and inside of the price of transportation is minerals for making cars and metals for making cars and rubber and fuel and everything, right? And so it's like if you had this, level of intelligence and this level of labor from robotics, and you had as much energy as you need to run it, you can start to see how the prices will go down. And then if you make those prices go down, it feeds back into itself. So if cars are cheaper, then transportation is cheaper, which makes other things that aren't robotics and intelligence cheaper. Think about chemicals or, food delivery or whatever else, right? It's going to make those things cheaper. If you make those things cheaper, people can afford more stuff, which means they can spend on other things. That and the flywheel goes on and on and on, right?
This is what I think is no end state.
Practical way to make this happen.
There is no end state. Okay, that's good.
We will hit bottlenecks, right? I happen to think for the next 100 years, almost every bottleneck is a governance problem, not a technological or physical problem. We have this technology today, like the LLMs that we have are plenty intelligence to do what we need to do. The robots that we have today are getting pretty close to what we need to have humanoid robot automation. So really the question is like, what bottleneck will we hit? Call it 100,000 years from now, it'll be like, there's not enough ability for the earth to diffuse the heat from all of the industrial processes we're doing, but we are really far away from that.
Yeah.
But there's some point between, Star Wars' capital planet where it's covered in metal and it's like, we're not there anytime soon. And then today. And I think that, with solar and SMRs and robots and intelligence that we have today, we could go many, many miles from where we are into levels of abundance that we can't even imagine before we hit the next bottleneck. That's truly like a physical bottleneck, like running out of minerals on Earth or running out of fresh water, running out of, land space. I just don't think those things are going to be bottlenecks because they could be solved with the technologies we're talking about. With fresh water, with enough desalination plants and solar panels, you have as much fresh water as you could ever use. With enough labor, there's plenty of minerals on Earth to do what we want to do. If you need more land, build up, right? If you need more farmland, it's like you can still build up. There are vertical farms, but most of the cost of a vertical farm is the energy to run the lights.
Yeah.
Again, if you have cheap energy, then you have cheap food and cheap land. So I think that this is why I want people to think about it is like, if we do this, there is no end in sight, or at least there's no end in sight for how long we live. And our children and our grandchildren will live in a world that is unrecognizable to us.
And we're not creating a garbage can because, the kind of leisure and then creativity which comes from this kind of wealth, it affords maybe ideas, which, I tend to believe in some esoteric stuff. So those can be accessed. And those physical bottlenecks, which we think are bottlenecks at the moment, would not be bottlenecks, because
it would not. Yeah.
You might already have solutions. Okay, so how does this bubble, this literal physical bubble? Because I was thinking more in the terms of abstract when we talked about earlier, but you mean like a literal place, like this is the dome. Now, how does this expand to at least cover the world with all humans?
Right. So imagine, thought experiment here. You had the bubble was over Texas, and you had this unimaginable abundance, and the rest of the world was exactly the way it is today, right? If you expanded that bubble to the whole Earth, but you only had Texas's productive capacity, it would no longer be an abundant place.
Right.
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 Because there would not be that level of supply to handle 8 billion people. There's only enough supply to handle the tens of millions in Texas.
So you do need
Right?
walls
So
as long as the productivity is not going out, build that
that's the
wall.
question. That's the question.
Right.
I happen to think that the problem with, going from, okay, the bubble's over Texas to now it includes New Mexico and now it includes Arizona and now it includes California, is that those places will have a different governing structure that is incompatible with how we got to abundance.
Right.
Because we can't get to abundance without allowing margins to get so thin. We're talking fractions of penny per strawberry, right? Or fractions of penny per car, right? Like that's the level of margins things need to shrink to. We talk about gross margins for cars today. Tesla's gross margins for a car, like the amount of money they make per car is like in the thousands or tens of thousands, right, of dollars. And we need to get that down to like cents, right? If a car is going to cost $10, the margins are going to be $1 maybe, right? And so that means that the margins for the seat in the car have to get down even more, right? So we have to have a governing structure that is compatible with that. And business people right now are not compatible with that. They're used to gross margins that are between 5 and 10,000%, depending on the product.
Right.
Right. And that's where we have to talk about like what governing structure is going to be compatible with a world of abundance. And I think you really do need to get rid of the cronies. You need as pure capitalism as you can. And that requires, an even more safeguarded democracy to keep those business people from capturing and rent seeking and creating the things. Because rent seeking essentially creates price increases, right? Because it's non-productive wealth, right? It's extractive money. What we need is every cent of wealth to be, creating the next level of productivity that creates that next level of abundance. And so if I were to take, Texas, imagine magically this happens. Again, it's a big if. And we put California inside the bubble, but didn't ask California to change. There's no way that it would last, right? So I think that what's going to have to happen is immigration. I really don't think you're going to be able to expand the bubble physically as easily as you're going to be able to inflate the bubble with more people.
Could you have copycat regimes though?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's what I mean is that the only time that it'll be compatible or the only time the bubble can expand is when some governing body is compatible with it and then they can share space, right? Or it's independent. Texas does it in their model and Singapore does it in their model.
Yeah.
And then that's what happens is that these bubbles pop up or they expand. But I do think that most of the world is incompatible with what is necessary to make abundance.
Why?
I don't think you can have planned economies at all.
Right.
I think of like China. They're not a completely planned economy, but they do pick winners and losers.
Yeah.
That's not unique to China. I'm just thinking of, the most extreme case of a lot of folks. They pick winners and losers, which creates the inefficiencies that are incompatible with that level of margin that you're going to need in order to create that level of abundance. It's got to be that like there are no cronies, right? For every $1 million siphoned off due to corruption, that's $1 million of capital or margin that could have been used better. And so, I think you have to have as pure of capitalism as possible to get to that level. I do think that it's not one or the other. If we do better, like better than we do today, we can get to better levels of abundance. But if we want to get to this like unimaginable level, we're going to have to create, systems that are pretty hard for us to imagine today.
And if this alternative universe Texas can do it, then this could become the envy of the world. And I mean that word envy in a good sense. In a bad sense, of course, Texas will need to protect itself, but then in a good sense, people could study it, copy it. And if Texas wasn't like, oh no, we're not going to share it. It's in their interest to share it because, why not? So then people could, okay.
Well, if I only make fractions of a penny per car, I need to sell more cars. It means I need more people in my bubble, right?
Yeah.
So I do think there's going to be this natural incentivization to expand, or at least import population, so that the influence of the bubble can expand, even if the geographic bubble doesn't change.
Right.
And I think that's going to be the challenge. Is you're going to get, human nature, I don't think is going to change in the next 20 years. So
minus
you're
some
still going to have
genetic
protectionists.
Things which it could come in, it could come in.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, or the second coming of Jesus. But you know, again, those things are hard to expect.
Yeah.
So we're going to have this conversation of like, is the culture of what's inside this bubble going to allow other people in? If not, then, people like me that want to expand the bubble, but, can't convince my fellow man to let people in, I'm going to go someplace else. And I'm going to find, the next closest place that is compatible and make the bubble there.
Right.
And then see if they're willing to do it. And if not, just keep rinse and repeat until the whole world is under that dome. But I don't know if it's going to be one dome or it's going to be many little domes. That is an open question. And I also don't know, are there cultures that are unwilling to change enough that they'll never have abundance? Or they're going to have to change their culture before they can even accept the world as it is. I think of, this might be controversial, but places in the Middle East seem to be more obsessed with religious conflict than they would be with improving their own lot. And that's, I don't know what it's going to take for places that, are culturally holding themselves back from that level of abundance to change. I don't know if that's immigration over time, where like this great, city on a hill exists, or at least a place that's much better exists, and people strive to go there. And the people that are willing to change go immigrate. And so then it leaves behind folks that are just unwilling. Or if you're going to have these revolutions where people are like, this obviously works and this obviously doesn't, and we want this thing, so we're going to change where we are. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that there are cultures and governments that are so obsessed with their own power, and they're so obsessed with their own, ideology, that they are unwilling to create a system of prosperity.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't name them all. I don't know how many that is, but it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, but it's not, I don't think it's impossible. Like, let's imagine a kind of a positive scenario where these people who have immigrated from non-bubble areas to bubble areas, and then they want to, temporarily, or, in an expat sense, immigrate back to where they came from, and maybe make changes there and then come back, so that could work. And if you have this archipelago, you could form a big bubble. Okay. All right.
Yes. And it's not like, all of America or any other place on earth is like, that much, like perfectly aligned with abundance, or, like culturally going to be that much better. I just mean that like there are some ideologies that seem to be, more obsessed with their ideology than their own prosperity. And that happens in small, in pockets everywhere. But I think there are some regimes that exist and have imposed it over an entire country. But like, I would say that there are psychopaths in the United States. There are definitely psychopaths in the United States that are willing to have 330 some odd million people in slavery and 1,000 people in wealth.
Right.
I think that the number of those folks is small, but I do think that does exist, and we need to root them out so we can all share in the prosperity and create these archipelagos of abundance to start the ball rolling.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next part about craft economy and leisure versus even more expansion of the bubble, let's beyond the solar system or whatever, can we, like, two ideas that I had was like, I don't know how this happens politically, but LVT, land value taxes, tax on the unimproved value of the land, which I think that's the only real tax that should be there. You can have sales taxes mixed in till you get there, but whatever. And because you need to, fund this structure, which makes this abundance possible. And also perhaps like hard currency, that you can't just inflate it. Like, do you think these two components are important in order to root out the rent seeking and the, BS that goes on?
That's totally reading the answers at the end of the textbook. But I would say, to lead people there, I'm agnostic to ideology. My ideology is about abundance. My ideology is about, the worth of a human being and I want as many people to flourish as possible.
Mm.
And whatever's going to do that and actually work is my ideology.
Right. Sure.
Right. And the question is, are you being ideological as the foundation of your practical implementation of how you get there? Or are you ideological about the outcome and you're trying to be pragmatic about how you get there? And I think that it's much better to be the latter. And so, you know, when you look at the world and history, there's many clues about what works and doesn't work, right? And when you think about like the way that a world of abundance would have to work, you know, like literally the prices of things would have to be so low that we just like can't even fathom it, which means that we have to produce so much more, which means that, you know, the profits of companies are going to have to be smaller, and that's going to require competition. You know, it can't have central planning because there's no way we have enough intelligence to actually plan that. It's the idea of like, you have to have these prerequisites for abundance to work. How do you go from where we are today to a world that is that hyper competitive, lack of cronies, lack of rent seeking, lack of, you know, abuses of power, enough, you know, rule of law that nobody's stealing from, not nobody, but like the amount of stealing and, you know, burning down people's houses because you're mad at them, like whatever, you know, murder, all these things have to go down to a level that prices are that low. And the question is how you get from here to there. Or, you know, start over. Like imagine that everybody had a fresh brain and had never heard of capitalism, had never heard of socialism, had never heard of, you know, anything. The question is, how do you organize a society that could do that? And I think that what we've learned is that throughout history, that what actually works is harnessing human nature, you know, and not trying to combat it.
Yeah.
And human nature is to want more. It's somewhat altruistic, but not perfectly altruistic. You know, humans need community. Humans need food. We need water. We need shelter. We need all these things. And so how do we create a system that works? And I happen to think, you know, the way we organize labor has to be capitalistic. And that's where capitalism comes in. It seems to be the closest thing to harnessing human nature's bad tendencies to create good outcomes.
Yes.
But the question is, you know, it's like layer one is we need human flourishing. And layer two is humans are this kind of selfish beings, and capitalism is the next layer of like how we build up from there. And then the question is, how do you keep capitalism working?
Yes, yes,
right?
yes. How do you not reach some kind of an end state?
Yeah, I think that people start with we need democracy, then we need capitalism. But I honestly think that the world is we need capitalism, and then we need democracy to keep capitalism.
Right.
Right. We can't have capitalism by monarch. Right? Because monarchies eventually get corrupted. You know, even if you had Jesus himself, you know, on the throne, but he died 100 years later, you would have some poor schmuck that could never actually make it that perfect again.
Yeah.
Right? You need some system that is going to keep the capitalists accountable and keep them from becoming cronies. And I think that's where you need democracy, or at least democratic, you know, thinking.
Elections and with principles, kind of constitution. Yeah.
Yes. And I happen to think that what we've learned is that republics are the only system that can work at larger scale. Because democracies that are really, really big really struggle to have a unified vision. And part of that is, you know, what works in one city doesn't work in another city because their cultures are different, their resources are different. You know, it's the same problem with California. It's like, it really should be 15 states, not one, if you wanted things to be governed more, you know, appropriately for each group of people.
Right.
And so I think you need, you know, capitalism, democracy, republicanism on top of that. And then you can sort of spread out from there to like, okay, what kind of things inside of that are going to create the barrier between politics and money, right? How are you going to keep competition in the economic sphere from corrupting the political sphere, where, you know, politics is as perfectly responsive as possible to the needs of people. And that's where, like, you know, mob mentality is bad. So you have a republic with checks and balances, not pure democracy. And so I think that's why, you know, like the American system, I think, is as close to a perfect constitution as we could get. I think there's definitely some changes, like the Equal Rights Amendment, so that all humans have equal rights. You not just kind of like some of the vestiges of like women still are not mentioned as equal partners in the Constitution.
It's also exportable in the sense that,
Yes.
you could kind of imbibe it in any culture, I think, outside America as well.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true.
No,
I think that
theoretically. I mean, if the culture is hell-bent on some collectivism, then no.
Exactly.
If it's just a minor difference, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not worried about collectivism. I'm actually worried about equalness.
Yeah.
Most people, given anarchy, would kill and hate everybody else outside of their group.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that there are some cultures that have like combated that better than others, but I still think there are many cultures out there that like they would never give equal rights given the choice, right, to everybody in their society.
Well, one controversial example is post-World War II Japan, where the Constitution was kind of written by Americans for them, and it worked out, So
it worked out, but look, like imagine the level of violence and the level of capitulation that was required for that to happen. And the other thing is like culturally, Japan was industrious, and culturally they were pretty homogenous.
Right.
Right. And that's like in my mind, that's a prerequisite to democracy working or democratic values working, is you need it to be semi-homogenous and you need it to be pretty industrious. If you have a group of folks, like call it stoner societies, they're not industrious enough, you're probably not going to have capitalism working that well, right? At least not immediately. I think that there are also societies that are non-homogenous where infighting will always create. But I think of like in the Middle East, you've had Kurdistan always being a problem, always having the problem of like it's never had a self-determination because it's been a part of many countries, right? And they are a distinct people. They are a distinct nation spread across many countries. And the problem has been that every country where they reside, they are a minority that has been oppressed. And you have that problem because there's this outgroup that's non-homogenous. And their culture, the culture of those places is not compatible with multiculturalism. It's very difficult to create a culture that is compatible with multiculturalism. And so that creates the conflict of second-class citizens.
Well, then the shining city on the hill is, like, I guess, the only hope, because if other people are, I guess, rational enough or selfish enough to want it, then they might want to be like, okay, what changes do we need to make to incorporate this aspect of that?
Yeah, and this is hard because I think America for a long time was the best example of being able to handle multiple cultures. But the thing is, like, it was a melting pot. There was assimilation. Right.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't like you come here and then there's a pocket of this here and a pocket of that there forever.
Yeah.
Exactly. I just don't think that works. Like there has to be a unifying culture. Right. It's like you can keep your food, you can keep your sensibilities about family, you can keep many things that are important and wonderful about your culture. But you can't bring your entire culture here, or it will be like a different system within the system. And that isn't compatible. Right. And I think that, if I wanted to work with human nature, what I would do is I would say, the best way to have a democracy is actually to split up countries' borders to match up more perfectly with nations.
Yeah,
so Kurdistan is a nation without a country.
That makes me a little uneasy because, like, with India, at least, the way there are like plenty of nations with this definition within the country, the nation state of India, and it works because the project is to unify rather than to balkanize further. So I know this, and also you could have like 600,000 nations if that's the definition of nation we are using. So maybe the culture part is more important than just the genetic stock.
If you can create a culture that is compatible with abundance in India, across every bit of India,
right?
And outside of that, there were still many cultures for the regional dialects and foods and sensibilities about family and religion and things like that. But like the realm that mattered for abundance was unified.
Yeah.
Then I don't think it's a different nation. Then India is one nation. Right. With many beautiful cultures inside of it.
Yeah.
Right. But what I'm saying is that there are many, many, many nations inside of, India, I don't know as well, but I think of like, we drew mostly the British and the French drew borders in their colonies that were incompatible, or they were not lined up with the nations that existed there, the cultures that were unified enough to work together.
Yeah.
And so, again, like you really spitball on here, it's like you'd have to be emperor of the world to make this happen. So I don't think it's going to happen. But I do think that if I were trying to organize myself, if I were one of these countries and I was like, look, I want to build prosperity, what I would do is I would, I would say, it's going to be painful. Yes, that nation's area has resources that I want. But if I really do want abundance, then I do need to like release these places to be their own countries so that they can have their own, we can reduce the violence inside of our borders by, creating separation. And then we can have international cooperation through trade and things like that.
Yeah.
But again, it's like you need an emperor of the world. But I think, the United States system, it's breaking down a bit right now. But like for a long time, like there was the melting pot, like unifying culture of like, this is what America is, that was enough, not perfect, but enough to unify the United States as one nation with many, many governing structures underneath it to allow like the more perfect lining up of laws to work with the cultures that happen to collect in different areas.
I think individualism does have some role to play in it as well, because that is like, because if the atom of society is some kind of a nation, which it changes, like cultures emerge, subculture nations start, subcultures, go down, all of those things happen. But like the universe, you could just go down like to every cell in the body. But I think like a whole individual being, if you stop there and you just consider that to be the atom. And then of course, people want to be with each other and all that and form all that culture. So that's a decent sort of Goldilocks zone, I think, which America chanced upon or whatever.
Yes. Well, you could, federations work.
Yeah.
Somewhat, right? You could feasibly think of Europe as the beginnings of a federation that's similar to the United States.
Yeah.
You could take the American Constitution. Right, exactly. You could take the American Constitution, create the European Federation that had that Constitution, and it would be mostly compatible with Europe, the way that most people seem to want to live, which is we have our own, like, Romania has its own education system, it has its own ideas about many things about how the world works, but there's like one unified military, right? There's one unified set of trade and currency and so on. Which if you take the American Constitution and you lay it back on top of the United States again, there's a lot of things that I think are actually different than what the Constitution says about how America currently works. So I think it's like, we also have to get a bit back to it ourselves. It's like the states need to be able to do a bit more, that there needs to be more states to closer align with, I think that the way to think about it is that a state inside of the United States should be drawn around an economic boundary.
Okay.
Right. So like what is economically similar to itself should be one state. So like in California, you have the Central Valley, which is like mostly farmland. And then you have LA, you have, the Bay Area, and you've got Northern California, and you've got like, like all these stretches that are so different from each other. But I think that the easiest boundary for a state, because a state's whole purpose is to manage things like education and, how land is zoned and used and all that stuff. That is the foundation of economics. Yeah. And that is the foundation of how economics works, or what's important to an economy. So I think it should be drawn around like, okay, LA, the Southern California and Inland Empire, everything in that mountain area should be, one state, which is very distinct from the Central Valley, which is very distinct from the Bay Area, which is very distinct from Northern California and so on.
But geared towards abundance, which hopefully could be a factor which unites, all these different states or new states you're proposing.
Yes. Right. Well, I think the problem is that we don't have a culture in California, or I'm no longer there, but the culture in California is not unified enough to handle that many different groups of folks, that many different economies, honestly. And so I think it needs to be, people would benefit from redrawing the boundaries of states to more closely align with people that have a lot in common. And I think it's a great idea for Eastern Oregon to like join Idaho, because Eastern Oregon is so incompatible with Western Oregon, but it's much more similar to Idaho.
Right.
I think we should be more open to that, because I think what would happen is you'd have economies that are more vibrant and more unified. They're able to benefit from their own successes more, instead of kind of like, cities siphoning off from, rural places, or rural places siphoning off from cities in various ways.
Okay. Well, we approaching the end of the scheduled time that we had, but I do want to speak about
Mm-hmm.
these two things which are going to be
You can keep
important.
going.
So, first one
Mm-hmm.
is, um, where do you think ideas come from? Like, I mean, I have an
Oh,
esoteric explanation for it, like with Tantra and
right.
Gnosticism and all that, which is like, I think it
Mm-hmm.
works. But like generally, like what's the secular and materialistic definition? Where do ideas come from?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is kind of important. It's
Yeah,
not just raw autistic intelligence. You need like sparks.
sure. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a very nebulous concept. I think like,
Yet
um,
very important to make new technologies.
yes, well, you can either start from the metaphysical and work forward, or I think you can kind of work like, where did I get ideas
Hmm.
and what were the conditions for that?
Right.
um,
Yeah, a nice walk,
and that it's like those
think and sleep.
conditions.
Yeah,
Yes, well, those conditions are more compatible with whatever,
yeah.
creates the idea, whether it's me or some combination of things. I get ideas on walks. I get ideas while talking to people. I especially get ideas when people challenge me
Hmm.
because it breaks down the calcified idea that needs to be, rethought because it's incompatible with reality.
Hmm.
Um, or I can't explain it well enough. So then you break it down further and further, and then you have like a more solid base, and many things can be built on top of that.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so that's where I came up with the idea for civilization being whatever reduces violence. It's like I started to like break apart like what is civilization?
Yeah.
What do we call civilized, societies? What
Not
are they
brutes,
like?
no
What
savages. I
happens
mean,
to them? Well, yeah, but like, what is a savage by definition?
yeah, yeah.
And I came to the idea like savages are people that are violent and use coercion, which could be a cronyist or it could be a murderer. It doesn't really
Hmm.
matter.
Hmm.
It's violence. But that was the unifying idea anyway. So like breaking things down helps a lot. But I happen to think that um, our brains are the source of things, but I do think that our brains are more collaborative with other people
Hmm.
than we think today. I don't know if it's metaphysical, with like an actual like explanation, like a field theory for
Like a field
consciousness or
theory, like a
something.
or
But
a prana or a chi theory. Yeah, yeah. I tend to,
right, I don't
yeah,
know,
but
but
yeah,
I do get better ideas with other people,
yeah.
and uh, I get, you know, I see things develop more in community and in conflict
Right, right.
than I do with like people sitting there and writing by themselves in a dark room.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, though, I think the first time my sort of like metaphysical spark opened in school, when I guess the chemistry teacher said that this guy had the idea of the benzene ring in the dream, and I'm like, huh,
Mm-hmm.
okay. I don't know how I can reproduce that, but okay. But I don't want. That's the reason I got attracted towards the sort of esoteric traditions, is because they kind of try and systematize those conditions rather than it's just grace.
Right.
Because I'm like, okay, what the hell do I do then? Maybe if I don't have
Sure.
grace. So yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
that's one.
I
Second
think that
is
means deep
yeah,
understanding. I think that something truly novel can't come from a generalist that is uneducated about the topic,
yeah. It
right?
has to
Like
be like a
the,
weird
a
kind of
prerequisite,
yeah.
a prerequisite is definitely deep knowledge. Like I
Mm,
think that a generalist can synthesize things that are
mm,
new, and that's really important. But I don't think you get truly novel, amazing things without deep understanding. And honestly, like when I'm steeped in my work, I dream about it.
mm.
Whether it creates an idea or not, like I'm dreaming about it. I don't know if you ever played like video games for way too long and
I
then
used to.
dreaming in a
Hmm.
video game, right? So like, I think that's just a part of humanity is like that happens. And then dreams, your brain is just like, it's reorganizing.
Yeah.
What is that called? Defragmenting. So, things come together that weren't there before sometimes. So I think that's also part of it. It's like you have a deep knowledge of it, and then your brain just like randomly comes up with it. But it's one out of a million dreams that actually is useful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do this anymore that much, but like, proper binging on, well, before Netflix, we,
Yeah.
we, we just used to download or whatever, just get CDs and watch it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my first series was Boston Legal, and I watched it
Mm.
straight for like a week and a half. And I think I was
Wow.
one of the characters in Boston Legal, and I was, I don't know, it was just weird
Yeah.
shit that came up. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, I mean, this is
Yeah.
it's scary sometimes because if you're watching like an unnerving kind of thing, yeah, I don't want to be too steeply involved in that, but
Yes.
it does tend to happen. Okay,
Oh,
leisure,
absolutely.
craft
Mm-hmm.
economy, and then
Oh yeah.
continuous expanding, let's say, bubble of
Yes.
abundance with industriousness, and maybe the option to
Hmm.
switch between these two kind of ways of living.
Absolutely.
So sabbatical
Yeah.
versus, so do you think jobs are going to go away, or do you think we just will keep
Yeah.
inventing new jobs? And then if they do go
Sure.
away for some people, what's a craft economy? Like maybe draw some
Sure.
examples from Eton College and the upper classes of England in the 19th century. How does that work?
Sure. So we'll start with something most people in the audience will understand or know about off the top of their heads, which is UBI, Universal
Mm,
Basic Income. So most people that think about abundance, robotics, the future of labor, seem to come to this conclusion that we should have universal basic income, which is
mm,
essentially the idea that productivity is going to go to infinite amounts
yeah.
because of robotics and automation and things like that. But people are still going to need to live, so we're going to need to somehow distribute resources that people need.
Mm.
Um, and the easiest idea is like, cool, we're just going to pay people a certain amount of money to, buy the stuff.
Live. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think honestly, I think it's the best bad idea.
Best bad idea.
Um,
Okay.
yes, it's like it comes from a good place of like we shouldn't let people die.
Mm.
I mean, the worst idea is like fuck people
Yeah.
and just
Yeah. Yeah.
let people die,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's the worst of the worst ideas. It's
Yeah.
just like who cares? Like
Yeah.
if you
Sink
can't
or
make money in
swim.
this new world,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's ruthless and terrible.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, I think universal basic income is a temporary state, and it's also incompatible with long-term abundance.
Oh.
Because again, if I create universal basic income and I'm the capitalist that's charging you for food,
Mm.
I'm going to set my prices to whatever you can afford,
Right. Right. Right.
right? There's going to be no competition because there's no ability to make money beyond that. There's no ability to reduce price. There's no way because I'm not in the economy competing with other producers,
Mm.
right? So it's a bad outcome where there's 1,000 capitalists that own all the companies that make all the stuff,
Mm.
and then we have to buy from them, and the government sets our wages. Like that,
Right.
to me, is socialism by other means,
Mm.
and it has all of the downsides of socialism.
Right.
So imagine that this happened and like, oh man, yes, prices were low. We made $100,000 a year, everybody, and that was enough to buy whatever you wanted and go on vacation and whatever. That might work for the first year, but I think that, whether it's 100 years later or 1,000 years later, the people with the power will abuse the ability to set your wage. They have all the power over you. Your entire livelihood, what you need to survive, comes from one entity.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter if there's 100 countries that all have UBI. If you live in that country, your livelihood, your survival comes from that one entity.
Yeah.
Right? And that will be abused. Human nature is not going to change that quickly. We are going to have this problem where people are going to abuse it.
That's
and
kind of
they're
the
psychopaths.
road to serfdom. Hayek. Is it Hayek or is it the other
Exactly.
guy? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And you're going to go back. You're going to go back to feudalism,
Mm.
right? But it's going to be even worse because they don't need you.
Yeah.
They don't need me.
Mm.
They have the robots. They got the AIs, right?
Mm.
So it's, I think that UBI is again another system that will slide us back into feudalism.
Mm.
Even if it's implemented amazingly, I think you'd slide back into feudalism. So the question is, how do you preserve the ability for people to earn their livelihood, but that livelihood is plenty, right? And the question is like, okay, well, I'm never going to be able to compete with a robot for picking strawberries, right? Nor would I want to. That's a terrible job. It's so painful and difficult. It makes me sad to see how many people put themselves through that just to make enough of a living to live in the United States. That job should not exist if there's a better alternative, right? And so I think that, the way to preserve people's autonomy over their income, while every job or most jobs being awesome, but also like still preserving capitalism, is what I call the craft economy, which is humans buy stuff made by other humans because it's made
by
by
humans. Right.
Right. If I can, if I build this world of abundance, the IKEA version of the table is going to be, there's going to be 10 million of them and it's going to be 10 cents, but everybody's going to have that table, right? And it's going to be exactly the same. It's going to be absolutely perfect, right? No flaws, no nothing. But hey, I like to make tables. I'm a carpenter, so I sell my tables, and humans use their discretionary income to buy the non-standard thing.
Hmm.
And that's, that doesn't have to be physical goods. It could also be content. Chess is my favorite example.
Hmm.
More people play chess than ever before.
Right.
But an AI is better at chess than any human.
Yeah.
People would have thought that, oh, now that the AIs are better at chess, no, why do we play chess?
Yeah.
Because it's a game.
Hmm.
I like to play because I like to play.
Yeah.
And now there's a bigger economy in chess because people create content to teach people how to play chess.
Right.
There are people you follow because you just like hearing them talk about chess. You have people that like to share their journey going from nothing to something in chess, right? People make like little wooden, chess sets that are better than like the random crappy magnetic ones that you take to the park. So I think that there's a whole economy around chess that wouldn't have existed until there was an abundance of discretionary income and an abundance of intelligence around chess. So I can play chess at any time, right? I can play with an intelligence instead of having to like find my friend.
Yeah.
Right. So that intelligence unlocked a bigger economy for something that is not productive. But people are making an income from that. So I think that if you could help people transition to that craft economy, making tables and chairs and jewelry and making content and making community spaces, and maybe they just like being a barista, like they like pulling shots and being the bartender of people that drink coffee instead of alcohol.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you're going to get an entire economy where, it's like far more expensive than the base level thing you could buy from a robotic system. But you're going to want it because it's also a status symbol. So maybe I'm the Mr. Beast of content, and I have much money. I'm going to buy like the expensive stuff made by the best artists, right? And those artists make more money because they are the best of the human stuff, right? And you still have this like hierarchy of income, and you have this hierarchy of status, of quality, and scarcity, right? Because the scarce thing is going to be whatever's made by humans instead of what's made in general.
I think the closest example
I think you could
is
build an entire economy on that.
Like the test cricket of, again, the gentleman's game. Again, 19th century, harking back to that class was definitely poor scarcity for their time, but they were very productive. So that's one thing. What about the other thing? Like, would you still, like, this is kind of like transitioning people to have jobs of meaning, but then would you need still jobs of productivity because desires don't go away, don't they? So you need jobs for that.
For sure. I just think that the way I define abundance is like the level of abundance is the percentage of humanity that's involved in producing what humans need to survive.
Okay.
Right. So as that approaches zero, you get to levels of abundance, right?
Right.
So the way to think about it for today is food, right? Like 99% of humanity was involved in producing food 1,000, 2,000 years ago because we fucking needed it, right? And now it's like much, much less. And in the United States, it's like less than 3% or something like that.
Right.
And so that's gone down, right? So imagine that happens with housing, that happens with transportation, electricity, water, everything. I think that you're still going to have some humans involved, and those are going to be businesses, just like my Etsy account where I'm selling tables is a business, right? And it's still entrepreneurship by other means. It's just that instead of producing like 2% of the world's needs for tables, I probably produce a lot more, or at least I produce millions instead of tens of thousands as a single entrepreneur because I'm increasing the supply by so much. So I think that you're still going to have entrepreneurs, you're going to have business owners, you're still going to have these folks that produce the food and so on. It's just that their margins are going to be so thin that it's like, yeah, you're going to be wealthy, but you're not going to be like that much wealthier than other folks. And I don't mean about how much money you have. I mean, like, we've raised the bar for abundance so much that like everybody lives like a billionaire.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, sure, I'm richer than them, but like there's only so much chocolate I can eat before I want to explode. There's only so many vacations I can take because literally there's only 365.25 days a year. Like what? Yeah, there's an upper limit to what wealth can actually do for you. And if you do this, then it's like, sure, they're wealthier, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
So I think you're going to get the craft economy will still be a hierarchical society, and there still will be wealth inequality, but who cares? Because everybody's living so well that I don't find that to be a moral failing. Like
so it's
today,
been gamified.
You can argue, yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is a game. It's just that, unfortunately, the game, if you lose the game, you die.
Yeah.
right? And in this world, the chances of losing the game and dying are much lower because, you know, we've built a society where there's so much supply that you don't have to work that much on your craft to afford subsistence. But you're probably going to work more than just enough for subsistence because you want more good stuff.
Okay.
And you want higher quality stuff. You want more human-made stuff. But I do think that the amount of hours people will need to work is going to go down, as it has for thousands of years.
Yeah.
It's just that, you know, we've never gotten to the point where it can go from, I have to work, you know, 100 hours a week, 40 hours a week, down to like 2 hours a week.
Yeah.
That's just going to be weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And
not
I think
necessarily.
we talked about the bubble expanding, right?
And the pioneers, like what's the plan for your pioneers? Yeah.
Yeah. So inside the bubble, I think the craft economy reigns supreme. Outside the bubble, you're going to have people trying to expand the bubble. So whether it's, you know, I moved from Texas to Utah to help expand the bubble to Utah, and I live in discomfort. I could go back to Texas and live abundance, right? But I go to Utah because like this is the frontier.
Yeah.
You know, I think 90% of humans are too lazy to wanna forego that level of abundance to like do something meaningful. But that's okay.
Yeah.
You're always going to have the pioneers, and so they go to the edge, right? Then it's Utah, then it's, you know, Arizona, then it's California, then it's Canada, then it's whatever, right? Like if you live 1,000 years, then we keep going. But then I think it's going to be Mars. It's going to be Jupiter's moons, right? We're going to have, the bubble is going to need to be expanded, and it's going to be easier in some places than others. I think it'll be easier to do it in Utah than California, but I do think it'll be much harder to do it on Mars because you're going to have to, you know, go from a standing start of a barren world to so much automation that it's actually, you know, even more automation than on Earth, because at least on Earth, we have the benefit of an ecosystem that creates much more accessible water and minerals and topsoil.
Right. And
so I think that's where you're going to have a two-tiered economy where people on the edges are, you know, the rough and tumble, you know, and that's going to be where the young people go, right? That's where the ambitious will go. But yeah.
For someone like me, I like to flirt with leisure, and I like to flirt with this kind of extreme productivity. So for me, it's going to be more like sabbatical today, you know, so like a 3-year sabbatical as an ambassador to wherever, right? And being the rough and tumble pioneer, and then maybe for 2-3 years come back to abundance, and then let's see what happens. So that is also like fun life. There is enough meaning there.
Yeah, you'll have your Texas citizenship, so you can always come back, right?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, I mean, this is great. You clearly put a lot of thought into it. Do you want any last thoughts to conclude this episode?
Yeah, just hope that people realize like abundance is actually not that far away. It's something that it's not a fantasy. It's not some magic thing. You know, and I think that the hard part is like imagining it first, wanting it second, and then expecting it third.
Yeah.
Like we should expect this. This is the future that we were promised in sci-fi, that we all want. Like we all crave heaven, and this is like a step closer to heaven.
Yeah.
And we should expect it. And when there are barriers between us and this, that's the bad people.
Right.
And they need to be overcome.
Yeah.
And so people that are advocating for things that are anti-abundance are usually the people that are the incumbents that benefit from keeping us away from that. So I just, you know, I want to encourage the audience to expect it, to demand it, to work for it, you know, and let's work together on doing it, because we can't wait forever. We must, you know, we must work towards this.
Yeah, it's close, but it's not inevitable if you don't do anything, right? So yeah. Okay.
Exactly. No.
All right, Greg. Thank you very much.
Saagar.
Absolutely. Well, just stick around 5 minutes, right? After the call. One more.